The reading this morning is by Paul Roche. There's a piece called Living It, Crossing Political Borders. It was given at the UUA General Assembly in 2014 in Providence at a workshop called Beyond Partisan Division. I think one or two of you may have been there with me. Anybody remember? Yeah. Paul was one of the founders of the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Sterling, Virginia. He says, I grew up an Irish Catholic in Boston. Like many Unitarian Universalists, I left the Catholic Church early on. My wife was not particularly enamored of her Armenian apostolic faith, but we eventually decided we wanted some religious education for our children. I stumbled across Emerson's writing and was shocked to find how they resonated with me. So we sought out a UU church. The concept of a free and responsible search for meaning was wonderful, and the fact that I could join others in a church setting to do so, I found nothing short of amazing. I craved a religion that would allow me to express and develop my own spirituality. Who knew one actually existed? We saw enough to like that we settled in as UUs. I'm a believer, supporter, and fighter for human rights, most especially gay rights, women's reproductive rights, and immigration rights. I've held signs and engaged in conversations in my neighborhood, polling places, trying to prevent the Virginia anti-gay constitutional amendment. For these things, my non-church friends and neighbors around the Washington, D.C. Beltway think that I'm a crazy liberal. But I also believe that the greatest issue facing the U.S. is the impending collapse of our economy, and that the way to fix it is primarily through lowered spending. For the latter and other positions on issues that are seen as conservative, I'm deemed a crazy conservative by my UU friends. The difference is, at church, it hurts. When friends ask me about my religion, I extol its virtues, but I also have to caveat that with, if you can handle the politics. I do not like having to do that. We, as a religious body, take great pains to be inclusive in our language, our music, our readings, and so on. A noble and surprisingly difficult effort. We're engaged in the great work of transforming our congregations to be places of anti-racism, anti-classism, and anti-oppression of all kinds. I agree strongly with this direction. It's my proposition that to be truly the church for the 21st century, we will need to welcome all of those that share our love for our faith and its 7 principles, our dreams and our aspirations, but may believe there's a different political path to get there. To accomplish this, we will need to affirmatively include in our screening lens not just ability, gender preference, male, female, but also political leanings. We need to say that everyone is welcome regardless of their party. I'm saying the only way for us to really grow in numbers and indeed in spirit is by being inclusive in words and deeds to people who do not necessarily toe the Democratic Party line. It's my belief that if we would only let it be known that all are welcome at our table, that we covenant to be in right relationship with everyone that walks through our doors, even people who might just vote for Mitt Romney, people who might actually upset the UU apple cart a little bit. We could grow in real numbers. Not overnight, of course. There's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done first. But if we could tap the spiritual but unchurched folks who hold moderate political views, we could greatly increase the impact of our actions and the effect they have on the world. We have a religion here that is too great to hide under a bushel basket of political dogma. Our UU light shines brightly, but we cloak it in political purity. Finally, as my friend Ralph Waldo Emerson says, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Think of the integrity we could foster by engaging all of our UU brain power in deeper discussions about the issues rather than jumping to partisan conclusions. So what needs to happen? How do we live this? Well, if if you agree with us, and I hope you do, we need you to help do this welcoming work in your congregations. To be clear, I'm not asking you to change your political leanings. I'm asking you to be courageous and raise an objection when the words of political derision are sprinkled in our sanctuaries. Call people on it. It's not the conservatives or moderates who will make these changes, nor is it just the liberals. It's all of us. Please be one of those who helps begin this change. It's not just the right thing to do. I truly believe our future as a religion depends upon it. When I was in 8th grade, our rural middle school was consolidated with a suburban school. I was coming from a little school in our town of Cottage Grove, where each grade of 25 or so had its own classroom. The town that we consolidated with was Monona Grove, a somewhat affluent suburb of Madison, just about 10 miles from us. I was raised in a conservative religious tradition, and I was intrigued by right-wing politics. And I carried a briefcase with a bumper sticker that read AU H2O 64 splayed across it. That is, I was a Goldwater fan. Now, as you can imagine, my briefcase with its bumper sticker made me stick out like a sore thumb in 8th grade. It was not the optimal way to impress the in crowd in a new school. And it happened that all of the kids from our rural school were tracked into the middle or lower sections of the 4 groups in our 8th grade. And at some point early in the year, my teachers decided that I was misclassified, and they proposed that I switch to the upper track. And since I was new to school, I was just starting to make a friend or two, and I didn't want to have to start all over again, so I said no. My English teacher yelled at me in class for being ungrateful. She said my teachers only wanted what was best for me, and the principal would like to see me. Turned out that C.F. Bain was a pretty unusual principal. He started the conversation by asking me what I was reading. Well, I was reading God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley, his by then decade-old diatribe against what he considered Yale's commitment to secularism and Keynesian economics, which he regarded as a slippery slope on the road to collectivism and, gasp, socialism. And I was reading something from our conservative religious heritage, probably the 1850 volume Lectures on Revival by Charles Grandison Finney. C.F. suggested, mildly, that I should try broadening my reading interests. He suggested I might read Martin Buber and Paul Tillich and maybe the economist John Kenneth Galbraith. And then, finally, towards the end of our talk, it took almost an hour, he gently suggested that I would profit quite a bit if I transferred to the top track, and so I agreed. It was actually the beginning of a very, very long relationship between me and C.F. Bain. It lasted for many years. The most dramatic bit was when I agreed in the summer of my junior year in college to finish roofing his house, which accounts, by the way, for the fact that my right arm still has limitations on motion because I fell off the roof. And incidentally, I was classified 4F when I was called up for the draft. Which was one of the nice things I was thinking on the way down. Actually, maybe it could get me out of the draft. Actually, as it happens, the political tendency that Goldwater ran on, which is generally referred to as movement conservatism, is now the dominant ideology of the Republican Party. I myself had decided that I probably was closer to the Democratic Party by the time the election of 1964 happened. I became concerned that Goldwater would get us into foreign adventures and that, for example, he would get us more deeply involved in the Vietnam War. Wait, that happened anyway, didn't It happens that movement conservatism as a movement has created a time when our political parties barely overlap. Most Democrats, very few Democrats would call themselves conservative, and very few Republicans would call themselves liberal. So a chasm has opened between our parties and more broadly between the red and blue parts of our United States. And unfortunately, the political dialogue these days between the different political persuasions more frequently turns to diatribe rather than dialogue. And we Unitarian Universalists identify ourselves as members of a liberal religion. Our religious commitments are in particular liberal in that we don't have a creed. We don't insist that everyone believe alike in matters of religious doctrine, and we welcome everyone regardless of belief. Or at least that's what we say, although in truth, Christians sometimes feel less welcome than Buddhists in many of our congregations. So it's an easy extension of our religious liberalism to the assumption that we are also all politically liberal. When we get into political questions, and by the way, our faith does call us to be active in the public square, many, if not most of us, would probably identify with the Democratic Party. So if someone were to express a deep concern about the deficits that were incurred to help pull us out of the recent Great Recession, like Paul Roche, or raised questions about too ready access to abortion, or heaven forfend about equal marriage, the instant response most of us would offer would be, but we're liberals! And that's a problem. As Paul Roche said in our reading this morning, it's my proposition that to be truly the church for the 21st century, we will need to welcome all those that share the love of our faith and its 7 principles, our dreams and our aspirations, but may believe there's a different political path to get there. We are a liberal religion, but that does not in fact entail that all of us are or should be liberal in politics. In many of our congregations, people are drawn by our diversity of religious beliefs only to discover fairly quickly that our tolerance of political diversity is less apparent. I'm very concerned about the degree to which our political differences are driving us apart as a nation. And I'm not blind to the probability that it is the actions of our Republican-dominated Congress that have, in their take no prisoner way, during the Obama administration, been mostly responsible for the paralysis in our government's ability to respond to national and international issues of great urgency. But there's a real risk to national and international solidarity when we find ourselves driven apart to such a degree that we can't even understand how people on the other side could possibly believe what they do. And when we find ourselves shouting denunciations across a Grand Canyon of incomprehension over the stupidity of those people. So I went back to listen more closely to the politics I'd committed myself to in the 8th grade before I switched my allegiance from Goldwater to Johnson. It seemed to me that it would be useful to try to get a better sense of what movement conservatism really was and is, if I was to have any hope of understanding the political beliefs of my relatives and of neighbors without retreating to just say, but we're liberals. Went back and read a biography of William F. Buckley. I came to understand how his political beliefs were deeply influenced by his father's experience as an entrepreneur in Mexico during the 1910 revolution there. I reread the economics chapter of God and Man at Yale, and I've started rereading Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. I read, heaven forfend, Ted Cruz's campaign autobiography, A Time for Truth. I learned that movement conservatism traces its roots back to the reaction against the New Deal in the 1930s, at a time when conservative, wealthy business people funded conservative institutions to carry their message. In fact, as it turns out, the movement traces its roots even farther back to the conflicts between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke over the French Revolution. And I had to rethink whether my image of the French Revolution, an uprising for freedom against the tyranny of feudalism, might not be entirely accurate. In fact, it seems to have been a much more complex social upheaval that, in fact, descended into terror, that destroyed many of the people who supported it and led the way to the rise of Napoleon, founder of a brand new despotism fueled by endless wars of conquest. Don't worry, I haven't given up my political convictions. I haven't reverted to the political beliefs I had in 8th grade. But I have gotten a better appreciation of the complexity of the disagreements between conservatives and liberals in this era. I actually found a lot about Ted Cruz to like. And I learned that our experiences growing up in our families were not as dissimilar as I might have thought. I found a lot to disagree with, and I found some of his arguments disingenuous. As it turns out, both of us were debaters in high school, and we learned to frame arguments effectively, if not always quite honestly. And I've come to believe that not paying attention to other political viewpoints make my own commitments shallower than they could be. I think Paul Roche is right when he says, think of the integrity we could foster by engaging all of our UU brain power in deeper discussions about the issues rather than jumping to partisan conclusions. Now, our theme for this whole month of January is, but we're liberals. So I just wanted to begin to sketch what I hope is a more nuanced description of some of the foundations of the deep political differences between conservatives and liberals these days. First, we have a big difference about what is the nature of human beings, our anthropology, if you will. We, many centuries ago, rejected the notion of original sin. We say in a child dedication service, such as we had just in November, child dedication in our Unitarian Universalist congregations is not the same as baptism or christening, which symbolizes a cleansing of original sin. We believe that children are born innocent, and at the heart of that innocence lies the capacity for both good and ill. Any parent who believes that their child will remain in innocence and show only signs of good will be disabused by about the age of 2, when the terrible twos intrude. And those of us who tried a more hands-off mode of discipline often found ourselves with serious difficulties with our kids as they were growing up. The thing is that we human beings are frail. We are imperfect. We cannot, in fact, become everything we might want to be. And there are various ways that the story of how this came to be has been told. There's the story of the Garden of Eden, an image of perfection, of ease within the garden, followed by a fall into the difficulties of living in the real world. And there's another story from Greek tradition of Pandora's box, which tells how human beings were comfortable and not oppressed by great evils until Pandora opened the box and out flew all of the horrors that beset us, and also hope, which we can always hold on to. Sometimes we can seem naive in not accepting the fact that there is both good and evil in each of us. We have to bear in mind that we are not perfect. And that's one of the points of conservatism. People need boundaries, they need rules, they need directions. So then it follows that the second point about social order is one way of giving boundaries to human beings. On the conservative side, it is held that some things are simply sacred. They, for example, tend to see the Constitution as a virtually sacred document. In many of our congregations, we've had difficulty saluting the flag. Those of us who came through the Vietnam War perhaps think less of the flag than others do. And that's a problem. because the flag is in fact simply a symbol of our United States. And when we allow it to be taken over only by conservatives, it means that we seem not to be as committed to our United States. One of the issues of social order that I've been struck by in some of the conservative writings is the growing number of out-of-wedlock births. Now, clearly one can think of this as a moral issue. People ought not to have kids till they get married. But more broadly, the concern is that the outcomes for kids in families where there aren't two parents are actually much worse than in families where there's one parent. And in many cases, what it amounts to is men fleeing from their responsibility. Almost half of births in some classes are now out of wedlock. And the result is that the kids suffer. Now, you and I may have some opinions about why this happens and what to do about it. But it's an issue that we perhaps ought to be more concerned about than we are. Conservatives tend to regard liberals as being utopians, as believing that we can create a perfect society. But there are risks to believing we can create a perfect society. For example, communism was an attempt to reshape from the ground up, and one result was that anyone who could not conform to the new order had to be set aside, eliminated. And so conservatives tend to be very concerned about systems of constitutional order, of checks and balances, because individuals will tend to want to grow their power when they're in power. Presidents will want to do more than perhaps they ought to. Congresses, judges may do more, and therefore we have a system that checks the impulses of our politicians. And then in international relations, there are some differences. There are, in fact, as conservatives like to point out, real enemies in the world, bullies like Putin, the risks from Islamic extremism. Now, I happen to believe that an intense hatred and reaction against another country generates counterattacks and builds strange and foolish walls between countries. So it's worth trying diplomacy with Iran, for example, as it was with Russia in the 1980s. But we have to recognize that there are risks. We can say give peace a chance, but peace sometimes requires strength as well. And I think, as I said before, that Islamic extremism is a case where, in facing ISIS, we have to recognize there's evil in the world. There are forces that will have to be convinced that they will never be able to live. And of course, life is not all about politics. Paul Roche says this in another part of his presentation. A hungry family does not care that the person volunteering at the food pantry may have voted for John McCain. In the Washington, D.C. area, we're blessed to be in a huge melting pot of the world's peoples and faiths. When we break bread at interfaith events, no one asks for whom the guy who made the macaroni and cheese, me, voted. I don't care whether the lady who made the chicken korma voted at all. We're there to eat and sing and dance and get to know one another, breaking down barriers. So I hope that we can make First Parish welcoming to a diversity of political opinions alongside our welcoming of a diversity of religious beliefs. I hope we can be welcoming across partisan lines, and that by listening closely we can find common ground and help to bridge some of the yawning chasm that threatens to tear our nation apart. Our covenant commits us to dwell together in peace, to speak the truth in love, and to help one another. Speaking the truth in love means listening first, listening deeply, and then expressing our own beliefs and opinions in dialogue with those we disagree with. May we learn to listen deeply, to understand with compassion, and to dwell together in peace. May it be so, and amen.